So welcome everyone again. This is the second session of the ABCs of Socialism with Peoria DSA. Last week we did an opening session on the essay, but at least capitalism is free and democratic, right? And that was presented by Anthony Walraven, who will be here shortly. I think we had some really good discussions, and I think it was a pretty productive exercise overall. So this week we will be discussing the essay, Isn't America Already Kind of Socialist?, which was by Chris Massano, who is a contributing editor for Jacobin Magazine, a DSA member, and I believe a union member. And I chose this essay because I think it's good, for one, and I think it does a good job of explaining some common misconceptions about socialism, but also for kind of a sentimental reason, because this was actually the essay that was discussed at the first DSA meeting I ever attended. Welcome, Anthony. I think when I read it and we talked about it at that meeting, it really clarified some things for me and also introduced me to some ideas that I've been able to really dig into a lot more over the last couple of years. So before I reread the essay, I decided to watch a presentation that the author wrote on it from a few years back. And when he introduced the topic in his speech, he brought up the dreaded snowplow memes. These were pretty prevalent on lefty or liberal Twitter a few years ago. If you don't remember them, they said things like a socialist snowplow, the tyranny never ends, and like snowplows, evil socialists at work, and stuff like that. I thought it was funny that Massano said that his outrage and annoyance over these dumb liberal tweets or memes inspired him to write this essay in the first place. And he was also particularly annoyed by this other meme that was pretty popular called the 55 Socialist Programs in the United States. And this essay goes into some of them, and we'll come back to why these programs might be lumped together and what they might have in common. Welcome, Noah. What they might in common with each other and all that in a minute. But first, I thought it'd be fun to run down the entire list. So that's what the meme looks like, and now we'll run through these. So as we go through these 55 socialist programs in the United States, ask yourself, is this socialism? So we have here the Department of Agriculture, Amber Alerts, Amtrak, public beaches, public busing services, business subsidies, the Census Bureau, the CIA, and some of the CIA's greatest hits. Federal student loans, dams, public defenders, disability insurance, the Department of Energy, the EPA, farm subsidies, the FBI, the FCC, the FDA, fire departments, food stamps, garbage collection, healthcare. This is actually breaking news. I think this story came out yesterday. Public housing, the IRS, public landfills, public libraries, Medicare, Medicaid, the military, state and national monuments, public museums, NASA, the National Weather Service, public parks, PBS, the Peace Corps, police departments, prisons and jails, public schools, Secret Service, sewer systems, snow removal services, of course, Social Security, public street lighting, the Department of Transportation, USPS, vaccines, veteran healthcare, welfare, the White House, the WIC program, and state zoos. So that's a pretty varied list. So what are all of these things, and what do they have in common? Why are they lumped together, and how are they different? Well, some of these things serve social needs. Some involve income redistribution. Some make absolutely no sense to me. Some are basic operational activities that any government would have. Some involve the state's vast apparatus of coercion and force. Really, the only thing they have in common is that Uncle Sam pays for them. So Bernie Sanders, for all of his virtues, is partially to blame for some of this confusion. For the past 6 years or so, he's had the biggest megaphone and platform of any proponent of socialism, and his attempts to destigmatize socialism have contributed to muddying the waters, particularly during his first campaign when he said things like this. I'm not going to do a Bernie voice. I thought about it, but I don't want to get canceled. So when you go to your public library, when you call your fire department or the police department, what do you think you're calling? These are socialist institutions. Well, what's the problem with this? For one, it defines socialism as any collective project funded by tax dollars and accomplished by government action. That is what makes up those 55 socialist programs. In a country where government frequently hurts people, annoys people, irritates people, frustrates people, this isn't a particularly good rhetorical strategy for selling socialism to people. Masano uses the quip, you like the DMV, you'll love socialism, isn't particularly strong slogan for most people. It also conflates all government action with socialism, forces us to defend the most objectionable forms of state activity, including the ones we're working to abolish, like the police, the carceral state, ICE. If all of those things are socialism, I think we have a problem. But it also has significant strategic implications. It's not just a matter of it being incorrect, it matters for our path forward. If the country was at least partially socialist, we would just need to gradually expand government. We wouldn't have to change the purpose of any of these existing programs, and we wouldn't have to reform the administrative structures of our government agencies within the state system. And this to me is kind of the money quote. This to me is largely what distinguishes liberal thought from socialist thought. Because all of these purportedly socialist programs have been won without fundamentally challenging private property, there would be no need for a break with the owners of capital and its political allies. So let's talk about some examples. Earned income tax credit, Medicare Part D, and Obamacare. These are all big, expensive programs that have been beneficial to many, but none of these have really done much to strengthen the power of workers or to undermine the power of the market over our lives. And they still provide disproportionate benefits for capitalist interests. So, if we look at each one, the earned income tax credit helps low-wage workers, but it's also an indirect subsidy for low-wage employers. Medicare Part D offers subsidies for low-income seniors, but it's also a giveaway to big pharma. And Obamacare gave people healthcare and extended healthcare coverage for some, but it did so while giving away billions to the insurance industry, which just strengthened the grip that the private for-profit insurance system has over our lives. So the ultimate takeaway here is that the size and scale of government spending doesn't tell you much about the actual politics at play. So why does this trend of reforms that are supposed to be for the people ultimately end up propping up capital and the wealthy? Why does this happen? So, well, the rich invest in blocking and limiting progressive reforms and outcomes through political spending and lobbying. They're able to shape policies for their own benefit. And one of the first things I thought about, not necessarily with the reform, but with an outcome, I thought about last November when we had the fair tax, I guess, initiative on the ballot in Illinois, and a whole bunch of rich people, particularly the richest person in the state, funneled a bunch of money in to shape public opinion, and we didn't get it. And that benefited them. Additionally, important posts in government, whether they're elected or appointed, aren't typically made up by the working class. They're made up by capitalists, the upper class, and to a lesser extent, people in middle income tax brackets. Even if their ideas and values differ in some ways, and they can be significant ways, like I think there's a big difference between like a social justice oriented liberal and like a neoconservative, but they still tend to have a shared interest in protecting the status quo and repressing any like significant reform that challenges the system. So go back. So here we're talking about like kind of the makeup and how these, I guess, these elements impact these reforms. But the next part of it is really talking about kind of how capitalism works in general and its relationship with the state and kind of the knot that capitalism has over the state. So, and the reason for that is because our government is dependent on some minimally robust level of economic activity to fund themselves. By and large, the state doesn't generate its own income. It raises funds through tax revenues and debt financing, which rely on or are directly related to the state of the capitalist economy and consequently its rates of growth and profitability. So if the economic activity declines, the state will find it increasingly difficult to fund its activities, which will in turn lead to a decline in its legitimacy and its level of popular support, which we know they do not want. And because economic activity is significantly determined by the investment decisions of private capitalists, these forces can essentially veto government policies, and they think that they think are against their interests. They can essentially undermine popular democracy no matter who's in office. And, if capitalists aren't induced to make investments through business subsidies and other incentives, they can simply refuse to invest, which leads to the problems that we already talked about. So these are some of the reasons why government action is so often favorable to capitalist interest. It's also how they're able to conflate their own interests with the larger public or national interest, because under a capitalist system, these are like basically interactively connected. So what we're talking about here is basically the status quo. This is the normal mode of government operation under capitalism, and these are the structures that are holding it in place. So if you think that's kind of a bummer, I would agree. So where does that leave us? Well, in the piece, Misano talks about how this won't be interrupted unless there's a mass struggle with organization and militancy. So to me, this leaves us in a place of consideration where we, if we can't just elect people, elect people into office and legislate our way to socialism, then we have to have a mass struggle. And we have to be thinking about what that looks like and what happens when the transition happens, or if a transition happens. So one thing he said was that a socialist transition would draw on mass popular support and most importantly, I would say direct participation in the affairs of government. And some examples he gives would be creating directly democratic bodies that supplant or complement representative institutions like Congress, but also dramatically overhaul state agencies and administrative structures. Welcome, Matthew. And lastly, talked about how public schools, welfare departments, planning agencies, courts, all other government agencies would invite workers and recipients to participate in the design and implementation of these services. Public sector unions could play a role in this endeavor, and they could organize both the providers and the users of public services to radically transform the administrative structures of government. And I think that radically transform part is the most significant, because we can talk about those 55 socialist programs in the United States, so-called 55 socialist programs in the United States, and what good they do, how they help people, what their value is. But no matter how good they are, they're not socialism unless we get to that radically transformation part where we get to the direct participation. So to go back to the answer, or to the question, isn't America already kind of socialist? We have an answer, and it's no. Socialism isn't just more government. It's about democratic ownership and control. So that is the end of the presentation. So this time we will get into some discussion. I think we got enough people for about 2 breakout rooms. And the question, which I'm going to put in chat here in a second, that I want to start with, basically are more of like review of what I just talked about. Because the way I think about it is that if these concepts are new to you, then answer these questions how you understand them. If they're not new to you, answer these questions how you would explain it to someone that you don't know, or, it's not familiar with these concepts. So the questions are, why does a socialist politician like Bernie Sanders and being in power not automatically translate to a socialist government? And the second question is, what are the mechanisms that force the state to act for capitalists and against workers? So I'm gonna put that in the chat. Now I'm going to put people in breakout rooms. And we'll bring everybody back in about 15 minutes and have a little bit more discussion, and then we'll do some more questions. All right, looks like everybody made it back. That was really fun for me, bouncing back and forth between the rooms. I've never done the breakout room feature before, but heard some really good things in both rooms. And I really wish that we, like the way it works when we record this, it doesn't record the breakout rooms. It just records the part where we're all here, because there's some really great conversations and points that people brought up and examples that I think would be really great for people who want to watch this. So let's quickly go through these questions, and if, let's say, 2 people from each room weighs in on these questions, I think that'll be good, and then we'll get some new questions and some more discussion. So does anyone want to jump in with why does a socialist politician like Bernie Sanders in power not automatically translate to a socialist government? How about from the Nicholas, Elise, Matthew, Dame room first?
Well, I think one of the points that we were trying to discuss together was the fact that just because the individual espouses some or many tenets of an ideological belief doesn't mean that that person can be the perfect delivery mechanism or instigator of said belief. So I identify as a socialist, but like it or not, I have within me non-socialist beliefs, whether they are more left or more right. There are things within me. So just the same, Bernie Sanders is a human being. He has his own beliefs, and he has the necessity to attain power. And those mechanisms that allow him to gain power are held or structured within a capitalist system. So he's not able to be this injection of pure socialist ideology, because he himself is not, for one, and for another, the way in which he continues to exist in the political space is by utilizing capitalist mechanisms, which inherently are contradictory to socialist ones.
Excellent. Thank you, Matthew. Could someone from the Emily, Noah, Anthony, Brent group add to that?
Yeah, I can add something. So we went over quite a bit in the time that we had, and I'll go over the last thing that we said. And that is like when talking to kind of, or when we're kind of like discussing policies and stuff. You know, Emily brought up and Brent also brought up kind of like when we're looking at socialist policies, like using like the discourse, like some people like it's hard to talk about like certain kind of policies because people, one, like aren't like rising up to that level of discourse yet. So I can't remember the example Brent used, but it was with the person who Bernie was going to work with. And it was about economic, theory. And they were just like, no, we can't really talk about these issues on the world, on the like national stage. And like something that I brought up is like a large portion of this country is also affected by the Red Scare still. I brought up like, I went out to dinner with my grandparents last night and I told them about like socialist policies, and it's like they like wanted nothing to do with it because they're still like in this 1960s where communism is bad no matter what it is. Like Stalin's going to kill trillions of people with communism, and kind of like that level of just like it's like a trigger word on almost. So like even if we were to get like a socialist president in office, there's going to be a large portion of the population that aren't going to be behind their policies. And if a large portion of the population isn't behind the policies that we create, well, then we're not going to actually have any kind of solidarity. And those policies aren't going to, in turn, really work for the people. So I think raising the level of discourse would really help. But Bernie Sanders being in power isn't going to be what does it.
Okay. Does someone want to, from the first group, talk about the mechanisms that force the state to act for capitalists and against workers? Elise or Nicholas?
I was trying to find the raise hand feature, but I can go. So one of the things that we were kind of discussing on this is that, so like I'm just speaking from my experience. So I work in the nonprofit industry. One of the ways that we can view the nonprofit industry as leftists and under this understanding of socialism is that it is like there are a lot of things that nonprofits will propose to do within their mission that are ostensibly pretty good things that I think as socialists and leftists we can get behind. But what happens is that nonprofits are a business. They are centered within the capitalist mode of production, and they're beholden to state funding or capitalist funding. Well, the capitalist funding limits their ability to challenge capital, and the state funding is dependent upon the decisions of people who are capitalists situated in the positions of power in the government. And because of that, there are rules and regulations around the nonprofit industry that they cannot adequately address or challenge capitalism. And that's just my example that I speak from experience.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Does someone from the other group want to add something to that? Emily.
I would.
Oh, sorry.
sorry,
Emily raised her hand first, Wally.
Yeah. So I'm sorry. I don't think we discussed this like specifically in the group. I think we just I don't know. I forgot. I forgot about the second question. I'm so sorry. But I do just really quickly want to answer it. The economy is especially, we can see this play out in Peoria in a massive way. The state and local governments essentially are forced into positions where they're beholden to businesses and companies because they're the primary source of jobs and the economy, for the state. So the state really has kind of a vested interest in catering to or pandering to capital in pretty much every way possible. I think the biggest way we see this is when they give massive tax breaks to corporations to basically just, come to our towns and exploit our workers. That's probably the biggest way, but I'm sure anybody could name another 50 examples just locally.
Well, you want to quickly add something, and then we'll get to some more questions.
Yeah, to me, the biggest way that the government is forced to serve the interests of capitalists is that in our capitalist system, investment is held in private hands. So the fear of any government, and traditionally the fear of any left-wing government in the world, is that the policies they enact will cause the capitalists to take resources and capital and go somewhere else. And that's the stick by which capitalism kind of regulates the actions of the state. So if you are a state, like look at South America, for example, look at Cuba. Yeah, it's a capital strike. Capital flight is another word for it. But when you enact policies that start to benefit the workers instead of the capitalists try to take the money and leave. And as socialists, we don't recognize that because we don't believe that money is theirs to take. But that is the stick that capitalism holds over the state, is that if you do not, and even if we can see in the ways Emily pointed out, if you do not give us these tax breaks, we will take Amazon factories and we'll put them in a place that will. If you go forward in Bolivia with these plans to nationalize your mines, we will take our money and we will go elsewhere. So I think like that is the biggest inflection point where capitalism kind of holds the whip over the state, is that in our mode of production, private entities and individuals are allowed to determine where investment goes.
Awesome. Oh, thanks, Elise. You want to jump in something before you get out of here? Okay. Well, thanks so much for coming. All right. So the next group of questions wanted to talk about mass struggle. Oh, Nicholas, you're killing me. All right. This will probably be our last group. No, I changed my mind. Okay, we're not going to do these questions. We're going to do the next set of questions. So let me change out these questions real quick. So if the answer to the titular essay is no, socialism isn't just more government, it's about democratic ownership and control. Yeah, we could just do this all in one group. That's fine at this point. What does that mean? What does that government look like to you? And how would this government affect your life if it came into being? I think we talk a lot about like, what would our lives be like if what would our working lives be like if capitalism didn't exist, if, work didn't have such a hold over our lives? But I want to talk more about the government itself. So I guess since we're not doing rooms, anybody can jump in. Emily and Wally, can you guys put your hands down if you're not answering? Wally, are you trying to answer? All right, Noah, you go ahead first.
So I guess what it would mean to me is, I think, like, one thing that we need to really look at when we're looking about trying to make a socialist government and what that socialist government looks like would be like the exit of capital in the government. So no more lobbying, no more kind of any kind of like ability for companies to kind of use their capital and their power to influence elections, to influence policies. Like we see these all the time with, like, you know, Republicans and Democrats, where like companies will literally write bills for them, and then the politicians will then present that on the Senate floor and say it's their bill, but it was really written by corporations. So like making things like that illegal, just pretty much exiting any kind of like influence that like corporations have on the government itself. And I mean, we kind of see that like with Cuba's government and Cuba's election cycle, where politicians in Cuba, like, they're not even allowed to have a campaign budget. Their thesis of what they want the politics to be like is posted on a bulletin board, and then that's pretty much all they get. Like they might be able to do speeches, but there's no like campaign ads everywhere. There's no huge donations to their campaigns. It's really just what their policies are, who they are as a person, and then that's how they get elected. There's nothing to do with capital pretty much when it comes to that. And then it's also the political parties themselves, or the one political party isn't allowed to even nominate a politician. They're just, the people run, and they are chosen by the people. It's not chosen by a party. It's not chosen by corporations. It's really just chosen by the people, and that's it. So I guess that's what that would mean to me.
All right, Emily.
Yeah, so I'm trying to find, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have jumped the gun and raised my hand before I found it. But I'm trying to find the section where he references the questions that we need to ask ourselves when we're determining if in fact something is socialist policy or not. And primarily they're like, does this serve capital? Does this kind of help capital grow? Are we feeding capital? And then also, does it expand like democracy for the individual? Does it kind of restore power to the people versus power to capital? And so while I don't have like a super specific answer to this question, for me, when I envision that world, that's kind of the starting point for me, is what things stop that cycle of feeding capital, or stop that process of helping capital, and kind of restore power back to people, the working class, who we ultimately believe should have it. So that's that.
That's a good answer. Wally, you want to go?
Yeah, it's hard for me to envision what a socialist government would look like in terms of all of the functions of it. But I think for me, a big thing would be that a lot of the archaic forms in our government have been abolished and gotten rid of. So a socialist form of government wouldn't have a Senate. It wouldn't have an electoral college. It wouldn't have an unelected Supreme Court that sits for life. It wouldn't have, the barrier to entry to run for office would be dramatically lower. It's almost impossible for a working class person to be able to run for office and support themselves. There'd be a lot less money. So like in a lot of European countries during their election cycles, like I'm most familiar with England, but I think it's like there's 650 seats in the House of Commons. You're allowed to spend $100,000 on the campaign in each seat. So every election, every party is allowed to spend about $6 million. There's everyone in France, everyone is allowed free broadcast time to kind of talk to the people. I think there's a lot of ways that the democracy of our government would be improved. It would be a necessary condition for there to be a socialist government. I don't know, like Emily said, I don't know what the broad forms would look like. I don't know how it would be arranged, but I know that the government would not treat the interests of capital and the interests of working people as not even the same, because obviously it's scaled against. But the interests of capital would have no say in that government. It would strictly be an expression of the working class and what they hope to accomplish.
I'm glad that you mentioned talking about like the structures and bodies that we would get rid of in your version of the socialist society, because I think that's some of the stuff that like we need to introduce people to that are like newer to these ideas. Because, I think a lot of people, they were introduced to socialism through the Bernie campaign. So they just think about like these kind of universal programs like Medicare for all and everything. And I think it's kind of a next step to get them to envision like this broader transformation. And I guess like the structures that wouldn't have to exist. These structures that like we think of as I don't know, almost natural because it's what we've had our whole lives, and the way it's taught in schools are like, this is the American project and it is like basically unchangeable. Matthew, Brent, do you guys want to jump in?
Sorry, it's hard for me to raise hand and do any of that perfunctory stuff because I'm using the mobile app.
We've got few enough people that I'm okay with it.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, it's hard for me to see when somebody's trying to talk. So the I guess specifically, what does it look like to me? What does this government look like to me? If I am allowed full autonomy, control of what I do with my life, but that I am permitted to, I'm given the resources necessary to live so that I may pursue whatever wants, desires I need within accepted norms. That's kind of, I'm guessing like to get down to the absolute minutia of what does my day-to-day look like. That's it. I'm not engaging with this internal dialogue of, well, should I do that? Can I do that? Is that a good use of my time because I have to work, or because that will cost money? Because if I spend money there, I spend resources there, I won't have the resources necessary elsewhere, or I need to worry about that. How much of my time is taken up with creating labor or producing goods from my labor that go to give me a more impure product as far as the resources I need to sustain myself. So I put in 1 hour's worth of labor and I get 0.75 hours of sustained life. And so it goes. If I was under a socialist, a purely socialist model, my assumption would be that it would be near utopian. I have everything that I put out, I get back in. So I guess it's a nebulous way of thinking, but that's what I have. A lot of what makes this sort of intuition difficult is that it seems defining there I go, is defining a socialist society or socialist government or what it would be like is a lot about defining what it isn't. Well, it isn't this. It doesn't have a Senate. It doesn't have lifetime appointments to a judiciary. These are the things it does not have. What does it have? Well, you know, it has freedom. It has needs met for all. Okay, but how? How does that do that? And I don't have an answer there. I just kind of have the dueling ideas of, well, if I'm looking for an ideal, the ideal is that all my needs and all the needs of the people that exist are met. But beyond how it gets there, how it does that, all I can say is it doesn't do that through X or it doesn't do that through Y. I don't have any clearer mapping in my mind as far as what that looks like or how that would function.
Yeah, as Wally said, I think that's a really good point, and I think that that's like partially why we're here. You know, that's partially why we organize and why we get together and why we have these conversations, because I think a lot of us are in that same place or a similar place, and other people are even farther behind than that. So it's not easy. It's not obvious. It's like a collective conversation and education. Emily, what did you want to add to that?
Yeah, so my main addition was going to be one of the mechanisms that I'm kind of fond of thinking about. Obviously, you know, since we exist in capitalism and profit is, you know, made from workers' labor, any socialist model is not going to involve a workplace wherein it's kind of a totally authoritarian situation, as we have right now. So in work environments, and even, you know, I'm sure people who work for NGOs can speak to this. This even happens in the nonprofit sector, specifically though, in the private and like for-profit sector where most of us probably work. They're little tyrannies of bosses who can do whatever they want and tell you whatever they, you know, want you to do. Now, granted, you know, plenty don't. That's not, you know, necessarily a thing that every boss does, but that's kind of the way that our workplaces are structured and organized. So kind of just breaking that pattern, I know in a socialist society will look much different. The relationship that employers and employees have will look much different. And will probably involve, you know, workplaces structured more either as co-ops or workplaces that are industries that are nationalized. And so their workers become direct employees of the state. There just won't be the inequality within the workplace that currently exists between employer and employee. So I just thought I could add that. That's a little bit of an explanation of some mechanics.
Awesome, thank you. Brent, did you want to jump in? Do you have anything to add?
I suppose, again, I don't have a ton to add. I think everyone brought up really good points. Again, I don't have the answer to what would that government look like either. Whether it's worker councils or what have you, but I think regardless of the actual structure, that it would be more radically democratic, you know, meaning that there's democracy infused at more points within the structure, which obviously we really don't have that so much here. We really have been resigned to just electoralism and, you know, electing that one person to represent all of our needs. But I will say that, you know, a socialist government, what it would do for me, I think, you know, on just a base level is remove a very large level of fear and existential dread, honestly, about existence. You know, no longer having to worry about whether I can afford like a potential surgery that might come up, whether I can afford to, to have a kid, to raise a family, whether I can afford to retire at a reasonable age and not have to work. So, I mean, I think that in and of itself is quite a huge change for what it would mean in my life, this type of government.
Blake, did someone raise their hand? I'm driving and I can't see.
Nope, you're good to go if you want to respond.
Okay. I know what Brent said made me think about something too on the democracy sphere. I think so like when we always talk about like, the things that happen in our workplace affect us more than the decisions made in government, or things of that nature. I think in a socialist government, a lot of this, like, so I'm in a union, right? And the union affects me more in my day-to-day life than like the goings on in Washington, D.C., right? However, I have to have a fear that what goes on in Washington, D.C. could somehow impede, like, they pass they ban unions or they do some other anti-worker shit. I think in a socialist government, I think that what would happen in that government would become less important to the people that lived in the country, because we would have democracy in so many other aspects of our lives, in our workplaces, in our communities, that there wouldn't be like Brent said, this existential fear that like you get the wrong guy in there and they're just gonna like fucking destroy everything. And so I think like, if we have a socialist government that views things from the perspective that takes the side of workers in a class struggle, then that opens up a lot more things that can be done by workers in a variety of fields. So where you probably would get to a point where if you're in a union like mine, where there's like 5 or 6 million people, well, actually we have 2, but like if you're in a large national union, the elections and the way that union interacts with you in the workplace could become much more important than what congressman or what president gets elected. Because in a socialist system, it's not going to be about that one person going back and forth. There's going to be the expectation. We're going to feel the same way about the government that Goldman Sachs feels about the government right now, that no matter who's in charge, they got their backs. Workers in a socialist government are going to feel like no matter who's in charge, they have the ability to grow and expand the fields of democracy and self-control into every aspect of their lives. And when they attain that, I do think that the workings of that government are going to become kind of less important to people than everything else that's going on in their life.
This has been a really great conversation. I'm going to leave it up to you guys. We could discuss a couple more questions I had that are kind of like a bridge between the first set of questions and that set of questions, or we can call it a day. What do you guys want to do?
I got 2 hours to go to get to Chicago, so you got a captive audience from me.
I am not feeling the greatest, so I might dip. My apologies, but it has been an awesome conversation.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, and thanks so much for joining us for it, Emily.
Absolutely. I'll talk to you guys later.
Feel better,
Bye,
friend.
comrades. Thanks. Bye, comrades.
All right, bye. Anybody else want to beat a couple more of these around?
I wouldn't mind doing a couple more. I've got some grocery shopping to do, but to be honest, this is more entertaining than that.
Okay. All right, let's do it. We can do it for 10 more minutes or maybe a couple minutes over since we start a little late. But with this set of questions, I wanted to talk about the mass struggle aspect of it. And we talked about how like some progressive reforms have been won through mass struggle. That's where we've seen some progress and some success. So I wanted to talk about what are some of the progressive reforms that have been won through mass struggle. And what are some progressive reforms that you could see as being viable for mass struggle? And what do you want to see? All right, thanks for joining us, Brent. Appreciate it, man. Anybody want to jump on the progressive reform question?
Hey Blake,
Noah?
could you post that in the chat?
Yes. I wrote it down somewhere. I guess I left a part out, but like basically, what are some progressive reforms that could help lead to a radical transformation?
Thank you. I think one kind of really big progressive reform, and it's something that our DSA chapter works on that would really help towards a radical transformation, is abolition work. One of the, like what we learned is like one of the main jobs of the police is to break up unions, break up strikes, break up, any kind of mass protest. And we even see that with Black Lives Matter during last summer, where, we had huge waves of people come out, and the police were there to kind of almost instigate those protesters into doing violent acts. I mean, they come out in full riot gear. So I think one like progressive reform that would be huge towards like radical transformation would be to cut down this police budget, because if the police don't have a budget to fight a mass wave of protesters, well, then we can get a lot more done through that mass struggle that, have led to reforms, like, to answer the first question, like the Civil Rights Bill in 1965. That was run through mass struggle. It wasn't just Martin Luther King that was out in the street peacefully protesting. It was groups like the Black Panthers that were out and had a militant mindset now, and like controlled their own communities. Things like that is what is going to get, that done. And if we don't have the police standing in our way with that, we would have that radical transformation.
Awesome. I think that's a really good example to start with. Does someone else have some other examples they want to talk about? Provide maybe a little bit different perspective.
I think that, I know we all talk about it so much that it like kind of seems like you're beating on a drum, but I really do think that like we could achieve through mass struggle more of a trying to think of how to word this, because we're talking about just reforms and not wholesale changes to the system. But I think with it, like a pretty big reform that we could achieve through mass struggle is like Medicare for all. And I read a book about like I've been reading books about like Britain's Labour Party and stuff, and one of the reasons why they believed that they were able to get the NHS done right after World War II was because that particular war forced all of England and to kind of share in the same miseries and burdens. And there was this sense after the war that if they had all gotten together to fight a war, they could all get together to give everyone health care. And it was that sense of class consciousness that they had that enabled them to pass that in the space of about a year and a half from the time it was proposed. It's something they've been talking about for a long time, but it once it started, it took like a year to get it done.
That's really interesting, and that's not something I know a whole lot about. What book are you reading? Anthony? All right, never mind. Matthew, you want to jump in here? All right, we lost Anthony. Matthew, you want to throw something out there, and we'll probably wrap this up in just a minute.
Can you hear me?
Now I can.
Oh, sorry about that. So yeah, no, I made the effort to try to reduce background noise and it went abominably. So no, to answer the first part of the question, do I know anything particularly that has been enacted through mass change? No, I do not. To mirror what Anthony was saying, I could see Medicare for All being such a policy or such a movement that would get mass class consciousness awakened. But regardless of what it is, I see it more as being something that is meeting people's needs physically, which is why I see Medicare for All being a policy that would drive greater class consciousness than, say, as awful as I feel saying it, than defunding the police, because my inherent skepticism and pessimism doesn't allow me to see past the ideas that if the police were to not exist, you flick your fingers and then in an instant, every police officer who was a police officer never remembered that they were. They are suddenly car salesmen and shoe repairmen, whatever. They are something else. Police are gone. The fact is that the capitalist need to protect their resources still exists. So they would just find something else. The state, a soldier, a private military contractor, somebody else would take their place. So instead, I see efforts to mobilize people around what they need, like healthcare or education or something to do with housing or food. So rather than just saying everything that Anthony said, the other one I would bring up would be something around either the cancellation of student debt or the continued fight against what's it called? Regarding rent, you get kicked out if you don't pay your rent. That word.
Eviction.
There it is, the eviction moratorium. So something around a housing strike or around an education-based cancellation of debt. Those things where it's something undeniable. Yes, there are people who will say, well, I didn't go through this. I could pay for school. I could pay for my house. I could pay for my healthcare. Why are you taking away my super deluxe class healthcare plan? And why are you making my contributions and my toil and my misery meaningless? Because I define that by the pain I had. Yes, that does exist, but there is still the sense that for those who do not have these things, who are still under that boot heel, still feeling that pain, something that meets their needs in that way, where it's a drive by your neighbor rather than a promise by a single ideologue or demagogue. I could see those things being something where people recognize that the greater action is possible and necessary from the people rather than from those in power. It's defunding the police, taking away resources only to bring them back elsewhere in other forms. I just don't see that. And again, I admit it. It's because of skepticism and pessimism. I just don't see that as creating a clan or moving towards a class consciousness. Not that they're unnecessary, not that they're not good. I just don't see that as creating those things because it doesn't, that addresses a problem, not a symptom. So there, soapbox done.
Noah, would you like to respond to that?
No, I completely agree. That is like definitely an issue that we're going to have to face eventually because, we are on this road towards, a lot of people are getting more and more into abolition, and that is something that we are going to have to face. And I mean, that is exactly why, Karl Marx was a big proponent of, the working class having guns and stuff like that, is to protect themselves against state-run power. Obviously, we can't do that with police because the police are, protected by the state. And if we were to do anything towards the police, regardless if they were trying to kill us or not, we would suffer massive penalties. No, I agree. Like if we do have to be conscious of that, like when we are looking at abolitionist work, like what are we replacing it with? And I think that is one of the driving force when we do start to think about policies. And I mean, we're going to talk about this in the next abolitionist group.
Hey, Noah.
Yeah.
Hey, sorry about this, but we've got somebody else joining us right now. Kind of late, but we'll let them join us. Right, go ahead.
But we're going to talk about this on our next abolitionist group. But like when we're talking about what abolitionist reforms look like, one of the proponents is we need to really look at like what are we replacing it with, because like Matthew said, like the capitalists are going to want to replace the police with something else that are going to protect its property, its capital. So that is a really excellent point, Matthew. I appreciate you for bringing that up.
Hi, Ken. Thanks for joining us. We're kind of wrapping up here.
Yeah, sorry I got here late. Thanks, but if it's going to be recorded and put on Facebook or something, I'll look at it for sure.
Yeah, it is. I'm trying to give you a chance to participate before we wrap it up. We were just talking about, what'd you say?
I follow your Facebook and your online stuff, so I'll come around. I'll find this recording. I just got here late. I had signed up for this, but I couldn't get to it on time today.
No problem. Well, thanks for joining us. We were just talking about like progressive reforms that have been won through mass struggle and what progressive reforms we could see as being viable through mass struggle, just kind of as the piece. We talked in the presentation, we talked about how socialism isn't just more government, and it has to be a radical transformation that involves democratic control and ownership. So we wanted to talk about like what are some of these reforms that could be viable through mass struggle that could lead to that radical transformation. So if you want to contribute to that conversation, you're more than welcome to. If not, we're probably just going to wrap this up.
No, it's fine. Yeah, I shouldn't probably be jumping in now, but I'll come back around for another event and I'll look at this event once you put it online. I'll go and take a look at it.
All right, fantastic. We
Thank you.
will be doing this again next week at 11 o'clock.
Okay.
And I will not be the host. It'll be Doug Johnson, our co-chair. And I believe we'll be talking, I can't remember what the essay is called, but it's about labor. I think it's about the importance of labor. Like I think it's called Why Do Socialists Care So Much About Labor?
Okay.
Excellent.
All right. Thank you.
All right, guys. Well, I think it's time to wrap this up. Thanks so much for you guys joining. We had more people earlier, Ken, but some people had to jump off. So we've just kind of been continuing to chat.
Okay. Got it.
So I'm going to stop the recording and hopefully see everybody next week.
Have a good night.